the fact that Gen AI is so easy to grok, even for a non-programmer, is what is really exciting about it. And that makes people get super excited in the short term. But to translate that into real value for the enterprise, it'll have to go through the gates that you mentioned, which is security and PII and copyright and all that stuff. And those things take time.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome back to AI and the Future of Work. Thanks again for making this one of the most downloaded podcasts about the future of work. If you enjoy what we do, please like, comment, and share in your favorite podcast app. And we'll keep sharing amazing conversations like the one we have for today. I'm your host, Dan Turchin, CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. I'm also an investor in and advisor to more than 30 AI-first companies. And as you know, a firm believer in the power of technology to make humans better. If you're passionate about changing the world with AI, or maybe just looking for your next adventure, let's talk. We learn from AI thought leaders weekly on this show. And of course, the added bonus is yet one AI fun fact each week. Today's fun fact: Steve Leisman from CNBC shared results from a survey of 1,000 US adults conducted in July, of which 69% say they're uncomfortable with AI that can mimic human thinking. Now, interestingly, that's up from 59% in 2016. In every major demographic group, discomfort levels have increased since 2016. The biggest difference is among white-collar workers, where the gap increased 29%. Of all AI uses, the highest level of discomfort is with self-driving cars, where 76% express discomfort. You can be sure lawmakers are reviewing the same data, and let's hope it accelerates a path to real AI governance. As always, we will link to the full article in today's show notes. Now, shifting to this week's conversation, Tim Guleri has had a remarkable run at Sierra Ventures since 2001. He's invested in transcendent companies, including SourceFire and Make My Trip, which both went public. Before that, Tim had a successful career as an entrepreneur and exec at companies like Scopus and Octane, which was acquired by Epiphany in 2000. Sierra has one of the strongest future of work and AI portfolios that includes companies like Paro, Krisp, and SupportLogic. In the interest of full disclosure, I'm an investor in both SupportLogic and Emtropy Labs, which was founded by a great former guest of the podcast, Harish Batlapenamurthy. And without further ado, Tim, welcome to the podcast. Let's get started by having you share a bit more about your background and how you got into this space.
Dan, thank you so much for the invite. I was looking forward to this conversation, and I think it'll be an exciting one. So my journey into venture capital, I think you touched on, I joined Sierra in 2001, was an ex-entrepreneur turned VC. I was lucky enough to joined Scopus Technology right after I came to the US and finished my post-graduation work. And Scopus was a small company in Emeryville, just starting to innovate in the CRM space, which obviously has become quite foundational today. And I learned, I call it my live MBA, because I started in engineering, went to the field, went to marketing, and we built it to a $120 million revenue company, took it public in 95, and then it got bought by Siebel Systems right after we took it public. And having seen success at such close proximity, I was really enthusiastic to be the CEO of my own venture, which was Octane. I started that in my garage a couple of miles from here, Mid-Peninsula here in the Valley, and built, with my three co-founders, product in the garage for a year. And built that to about a $50 million business. And we were on the altars of taking that public when we got bought by Epiphany, who you referenced in your introduction, which was a $3 billion transaction. Obviously, the lesson learned there is that you have to be at the right place at the right time to get these great exits. And then I ran into Peter Vettel, and one of my other partners from Scopus had introduced me to Sierra, and I joined in 2001. And our firm is, I can tell you more about that in a second, but that was my journey into venture capital. And I'm really excited to be part of this ecosystem and super happy to be on your podcast today.
As an entrepreneur, I can't imagine an investor being successful without having spent time as an entrepreneur, but of course I'm biased. Love to hear from you. How has your entrepreneurial background influenced your success as an investor?
I think it comes down to empathy. It comes down to sitting in the seat and understanding deeply how difficult and lonely the job of a CEO is. And the fact that you are forced to make many decisions a day, and obviously many of them could be right, many could be wrong, but this execution bias and the fact that you always have to be moving quickly, and having done that personally, I can really transfer myself in the seat of the CEO that I'm guiding or lucky enough to guide, and then that just makes for a more meaningful conversation, and it's not spreadsheet management, right? Which I think is the default if you haven't been through the entrepreneurial journey. So that's one. I think the second would be experience, because in a weird way, and I've been doing venture for over 20 years, things tend to repeat themselves. They just get called differently, but it's very much the same pattern on what creates a great foundation for a great company, which ultimately will sustain. And reminding entrepreneurs what those patterns are, and being thoughtful about building a company are things that I think you naturally have as a operator to becoming a VC. And having said that, some of the most successful VCs have not been operators. I think we just bring a different playbook, and one that I'm super comfortable with, especially given that Sierra focuses on early stage venture capital.
What's the most recently announced investment that you've made? And take us through your thought process. Why'd you write the check?
Yeah, I think the most recent one is a company called Simulate. It's based in Boston. It's a team that I've known for several years. In fact, this team did a company before doing Simulate, which was a company I looked at deeply, but was not that excited about the business plan, but really liked the founders. And again, coming back to empathy, gave them really good feedback at the time, and they were nice enough to come back to me the second time around. And I'll tell you what the company does in a second. But so John and Vivek were the founders of Simulate, are building a foundational model. So it's a Gen AI company, and they're targeting, starting with e-commerce, they're targeting the customer journey. So if you think about the largest companies that have been built that decode the customer journey, companies like Adobe and all the companies that are focused on that customer journey, they're trying to build a platform that can synthetically, using LLMs, produce 100% fidelity on the customer profile, such that you can start doing customer experimentation across your entire customer population, not just a sliver off the customer population, which is done in typically done in e-commerce today. So in other words, if you're Nike and you're launching a new shoe, you just sample 10% of the traffic and you guess and hope the other 90% behaves the same way. These guys are using an LLM to basically mimic 100% of that traffic. Very, very, and then Vivek, who's the co-founder and CTO, is a tenured professor at MIT. He graduated from Stanford, one of the brightest minds in the space, and I'm super excited to lead their round.
So as an entrepreneur and an investor, I'm excited that generative AI has reinvigorated the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And we're seeing, I know you are, certainly, I am as well, deal flow and new company formation. It feels a lot like, the early 2000s. But there's also the drawback of just, I'm sure you know it as well as anyone, just a bunch of features masquerading as companies. What's the telltale sign when you take a pitch that, you haven't found a Simulate, you've really found kind of an imposter that maybe, uses some pretty words like LLMs to make it seem like they're market ready? What's the first indicator to you?
I think there are two filters, and I think you make a really good point that there's a lot of Gen AI whitewashing that's happening in early stage venture, especially. So the two tests that, we put them through, just walking through the pitches, how deep is their technical thinking? Because we're Obviously, early stage B2B investors, we have a very, very deep technical bench around us, and we're pretty technical folks ourselves. So one easy way to test it is how they're thinking about the technology and the cutting edge of the technology when they talk about generative AI. And second is really, have they spent enough time in the domain? Because if you don't have design partner customers where you've gone like really underneath the covers and unlocked why a Gen AI native company deserves to exist and disrupt the incumbents, because you have to go on the assumption that all the incumbents are also going to inject Gen AI technology into their, into their offerings. So the question really is, knowing that's going to happen, and some of these companies are very highly capitalized, even with that, how are you going to deserve the right to be a $200-400 million ARR company? And I think that thinking and that level of clarity on the customer pain and design partners and what you bring to the table. So I think it's on those two axes of customer discovery is one axis, and the other one is depth of technology and pure thinking around the Gen AI stack, which obviously we know well. And if they fail on either of those, that's a pretender, and that's a very short meeting.
Having been at Sierra for 22 years, do you think that Gen AI is just another platform shift, like mobile, like cloud, like SaaS, like client server? Or is there something fundamentally different about about these technologies?
No, I think it's actually foundational, Dan. I really believe that the capability of this technology is really going to be, foundational in many, many ways. And I say that because I've been through all the other, sort of step function changes in tech. I think what Gen AI is doing is it is rethinking some of the ways in which efficiencies were brought to bear by client server or cloud. And that was mostly around an efficiency axis. What's really the big unlock in Gen AI is that the creation axis is being unlocked, right? So the way information and business processes are being created, that is the difference between Gen AI and the prior technologies. So, of course, efficiency is a given with Gen AI, but the creative axis is something that the prior technologies could not do as much. If you look at client server, if you look at like mobile, if you look at the cloud computing, these were all massive step functions on the efficiency axis. But on the creation axis, I think that's where the great unlock is, and a combination of efficiency and creation, and you can unlock and create multiple $1 trillion of market cap. And I think that's the foundational opportunity for us. And by the way, this is across all horizontal and all vertical technologies. So I tell my LPs when they're looking at Sierra Ventures as a potential place to land, that if you believe in B2B, you have to believe that, the total tech ecosystem is 5 trillion today, if you throw in everything. And we got a world GDP of 97 or 95, 97 trillion. We got ways to go. And part of what's going to power that is Gen AI. And I think it's really foundational to answer your question.
Given the performance of the Big Seven in the S&P 500 so far this year, many are saying that the spoils of Gen AI will go to big tech, whether that's, certainly kind of the big five data platforms, whether it's Facebook and Microsoft and Google and Amazon, Apple, et cetera. And likewise, in the app space, many are saying that Gen AI features will become bolt-ons to an Adobe platform or Microsoft platforms or Oracle, SAP, ServiceNow, et cetera.
Yeah.
Now, as an entrepreneur, I don't feel that way. I feel like it's easier than ever to disrupt the incumbents, but would love to get your perspective around what that ecosystem looks like in terms of monetizing Gen AI, let's say 24 months from now.
Yeah, I think it's a true statement that the existing superscalers that you mentioned are going to be benefiting quite a bit from the introduction of Gen AI capabilities. You're seeing obviously the early acceleration in revenue. I think GCP just announced an $8 billion quarter, and I mean these are really these are massive engines of companies that are taking a large chunk of the revenue that is potentially producible in these verticals. Having said that, there's always a counterbalance to these tech concentrators, which are things like open source, and LLMs are now being open source, and I think that ecosystem is also developing in parallel. But I think the vertical business process unlock, which I think is something that superscalers are not very good at, I think is going to be a very low-hanging fruit for entrepreneurs and companies of that ilk. I also don't believe that the incumbents sort of adding Gen AI capability is going to be as transformational as a sort of a Gen AI native company that sort of thinks through the business process all the way through. And I think those two are going to create like the opportunity set for the new entrepreneurs. I'll make another point, Dan, which I think is really exciting for me as a VC, because I think ultimately all companies are a financial product. You're ultimately a combination of your growth rate and your capability to produce EBITDA. And it doesn't really matter whether you're in HR tech or CRM or supply chain or pick your favorite vertical. If you look at the Gen AI opportunity to that lens, what is exciting to me is not only are Gen AI native companies growing faster, but they're doing so with lesser resources. So if you double click on a P&L of a Gen AI company and you look at the cost of marketing, the cost of sales, the cost of R&D, the cost of G&A, it is dramatically different than a similar company that was born a decade ago. And that unlock, which is you're growing faster with lesser resources and you're spending less, ultimately translates into EBITDA. And EBITDA translates into sustained value and market cap. So you will see transformational dollars per employee headcount, which is a very common metric that is quoted, when you look at a efficiency of a company, 220K or whatever is the gold standard. You will see software companies doing $1 million ahead, $2 million ahead, because Gen AI on Gen AI is actually a very powerful concept. And I believe that is going to happen. And that is where the bolt-ons are not going to be able to keep up with the natives. And, we're looking forward to, backing a handful of those.
So recently, Gartner came out and said IT spending will increase 4 to 6% in the next 12 months. And some non-trivial percentage of that increase will be attributed to Gen AI. I'd be curious to get your take on, call it a very simple 2x2 axis, one kind of open source Gen AI, closed source Gen AI, and then maybe just for kicks on the y-axis, call it Gen AI platforms versus Gen AI apps. I know I'm doing some hand waving here for the audience. They're just listening only, but would just love your insights into where you think enterprises are going to be writing checks if you simplify the ecosystem down to those 4 quadrants.
Yeah, I think, and then we have the fortune of having 80 chief information officers on Sierra's CXO advisory board. You might have heard about that. And they actually cut across very large verticals like pharmaceutical and manufacturing and finance, et cetera. So we are in constant conversation with these CXOs. In fact, we hosted a team of, I think there were about 17 or 18 group CIOs from LG a couple of weeks ago. And then last week we were hosting the CIO of Merck and company and his entire team that were nice enough to spend the whole day with us. What they're telling us, which is, a good way to answer your question, is that there is definitely massive interest in LLM and Gen AI adoption for their internal use cases. A lot of the use cases have to do with cost reduction. So these guys are looking at, the notion of sort of how do you optimize the people process, right? Using Gen AI techniques. And I think that's going to be the first unlock. And the reason that is easy for them to do is because there's no sort of PII and, the usual specter of something, bad happening if they're not in complete control of their, LLM infrastructure, right? So that's going to be where they're experimenting first. And I think then the next phase is going to be where they apply Gen AI to their businesses. So, effectively verticalizing the Gen AI techniques and what could be unlocked for their businesses. So I think the second one's a little further off, because to do that, they need to get comfortable with, compliance and hallucinations and all the negative aspects of Gen AI. But I think the first one is here and now, and they're investing very, very heavily in that currently.
What would your advice be to entrepreneurs who are looking for the right kinds of companies to target based on, the 80 or so CIOs or CXOs that you see come through the office? What's the advice to entrepreneurs?
But I think it's the same advice I gave the Simulate team, which is, build horizontally, but execute vertically. Right? Like you can always talk about horizontal infrastructure and entrepreneurs, by default like to think big, which is not a bad thing. But I think in the initial years, it's all about crossing the chasm with the birds of a feather that look similar to each other. And that I think the premium you get is on faster sales cycles, better referenceability, sort of the replication of one process looks like the other, getting more comfortable with customers' pain points. So I think vertical execution is kind of the key to the game. And ultimately, you can always unlock a new vertical later on when you get to 10, 20, $30 million in ARR. But I think for me, I try to, my sort of golden rule with early stage companies is build horizontal infrastructure, but execute vertically and to a particular pain point. And that would be my advice to startups that are, building from scratch.
All the entrepreneurs listening, rewind that one. That's really good advice, Tim. So as a technologist, one of the things that concerns me is what I'd say is a growing divide between unbridled enthusiasm for what generative AI can do and the very real limitations of what next word prediction is capable of.
Yeah,
I feel like a lot of topics you've already mentioned, biased output, the likelihood of IP leakage, copyright issues that have not been resolved, health and safety issues with regard to unfiltered or unmoderated content generation. These are all things, before you even get to the cost of running these models or the complexity operationally of running them, indicate to me that we might be in for what Gartner has called a trough of disillusionment in the hype cycle.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? I mean, are the expectations sustainable, or is it likely that we're going to miss some of them before the stuff really matures?
No, I think it's definitely the case, and I think that'll be the case with Gen AI, that the hype precedes value, and I think that is exactly where we are right now. And I don't believe that this is. I stand behind my earlier statement that this is way more of a step function than any other technology that's hit. Certainly. During my professional career, which is now going on multiple decades. But having said that, I think the speed at which it'll sort of allow that value to become obvious, right, is going to be longer than what the market believes it to be. So these sort of simple marketing use cases and writing copy or producing a picture, that is not sustainable value for a Fortune 1000 company. And then, it's a great place to bring the technology into the public awareness, which I think what OpenAI has done very well. And my niece is interning at Sierra right now, and I had her do a Gen AI LLM, prompt engineering course at Vanderbilt University, and she was A, blown away, and B, I was shocked at how proficient she became in a couple of weeks of just doing it. And she's a high schooler, right? So I think the fact that Gen AI is so easy to grok, even for a non-programmer, is what is really exciting about it. And that makes people get super excited in the short term. But to translate that into real value for the enterprise, it'll have to go through the gates that you mentioned, which is security and PII and copyright and all that stuff. And those things take time. And I'm not even talking about legislation right now, just the tech stack to mature, to allow a Merck or a LG, et cetera, to take advantage of those technologies. But I think if you kind of just push this forward, like in the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to be absolutely foundational. You'll see the impact, and that's kind of what Gartner calls, I think, slope of enlightenment or something. I forget the hype cycle, but that will happen. And I think it's going to be probably, 3 to 5 years out.
You mentioned the CXO's focus on cost reduction, which is a natural way to ask the question about job elimination through automation versus job augmentation.
Yeah.
Automation. What's your perspective on which careers may be created and which ones may be eliminated by AI?
Yeah, I think one needs to look at that or come at that question with what is it that AI directionally is becoming more and more capable of doing, right? And any job function that kind of sits in that sort of crosshair is at risk, right? So obviously the LLMs by the very nature, they have two defining characteristics. One is the fact that they are now becoming multimodal, so it's not just text, but it is any it's graphics, it's sound, etc. So my next statement is going to pertain to any kind of media. And the other one is the generation capability of simple thought patterns, right? Is this something that it just does intuitively because it has a large corpus of data on which it's been trained and always getting better. So when you think about people that are in the copyright business, marketing, people that are sort of in the publishing business, people that are in the sort of the news sort of casting business, they'll have to come at the business with a different level of skill sets, which are higher order skill set that is not something that LLMs will ever be able to do. I think the lower level stuff is something that is at risk, is my deep belief. Also, I think on the coding side, if you think of the low level coding tasks, which is integration testing, writing scripts and doing like low level tasks, I think that is all going to get automated. And so when you think about tasks that were traditionally outsourced to other companies that you didn't want to do because they weren't higher order bit, I think that becomes again challenging, and those people have to reskill or look for other ways to bring the best person to work.
And we're just getting started on so many of these important topics, but believe it or not, we're almost out of time. But I'm not letting you go without answering one last question for me. In your decades as an investor, I'm going to go out on a limb and say you've seen hundreds, possibly thousands of pitches. And I would love to know, what's one that comes to mind that was just bizarre, or the one that you tell over beers after hours, it shocked you, it's memorable.
When you say shocked me and memorable, on what dimension?
It surprised you. It may or may not have been a fundable business.
I have a great story for you there. So this was my third day on the job at Sierra, and Mark Benioff had obviously started Salesforce.com, but there was a time in Salesforce's early history when he was not the CEO, and they had another person who was CEO, who came to pitch my partnership for, I believe, the Series A round. And of course, I was the CRM expert, and they pulled me in. And the churn that Salesforce had at the time was very, very high because they were servicing very small companies at the time, et cetera. And this whole notion of like cloud CRM was in nobody's mind. And remember, Siebel Systems was a very successful large company. And I was third day on the job, et cetera. And I thought the deal was pretty interesting. And, other people had other ideas given the churn. So we ended up not doing the deal. So I would put this in the category of one that got away, obviously. But I think the more important story there is that one has to look past these early, sort of bumps on the skin or whatever, which are the imperfections, to really lock into the longer term opportunity that this entrepreneurial team had unlocked, which is cloud-based delivery of software, right? And I think, I remember that as a lesson every time I meet an entrepreneur, and try not to focus on the obvious imperfections that are obvious today, But directionally, if the market is going to move in this direction, and the rate, the waves are going to start cresting in this direction, is this the team that can then ride that that wave and create a massive company? And so that is a story I tell over years. And I'm a huge fan of Mark Benioff, who's a good friend of the firm, and he's produced some phenomenal leaders in this market, and obviously a company that keeps reinventing itself. I think sitting close to 200 billion in market cap today, and a great story of sustained success.
Every investor needs an anti-portfolio. That's a great story. I remember selecting Upshot as our CRM because Salesforce at the time was so immature, and it was clear. It was just clear that Upshot was going to run away with the market.
Yeah, you shouldn't have bet against Mark. That was a mistake. I think.
Lesson learned.
Lesson learned.
Hey, Tim, we're out of time, but where can the audience learn more about you and Sierra?
We are always available. Obviously, lots of information on our website. I'm also like 24/7, like my entrepreneurs. All my information is on the web. I'm happy to talk to you any hour of the day and any day of the week.
Tim, I love this conversation. I hope you'll come back another time and we'll pick up where we left off.
No, my pleasure, Dan. Thank you for the invite, and we'll talk again. Cheers.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week on AI and the future of work. As always, I'm your host, Dan Turchin from PeopleRain. And of course, we're back next week with another fascinating guest.